Hi, Hazel. So good to see you.
So good to see you. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good.
Good. I'm excited to talk about this topic today. Before we get started, let's tell the viewers a little bit about your background and how you even came to be interested about this specific topic.
Yeah, happy to. So I am a doctoral student at Syracuse University in their higher education program. I have worked in higher education close to 20 years now, in various roles, but mostly related to communications. Most recently, I took a position at Colgate University as Vice President and Chief of Staff to the President. Um, so very much interested in higher education leadership, and that's what brought me to the doctoral program at Syracuse.
Got it. I love it. I'm biased in many ways. One, I'm an alumni of Syracuse University and also founder of One X League, which you all remember. But I just want to just throw that in there real quick. But
Go
let's go
Orange.
ahead and get started. So, first question. How are Black women presidents represented in the press?
This is actually my dissertation topic. So I researched eight Black women college presidents, and I can run through them because I love to talk about them. The first was Janetta Cole. She was appointed president at Spelman College in 1987, which noted that was 100 years or so after Spelman, a Black women's college, was founded. Okay, yeah.
Mhm.
The second woman, Shirley Ann Jackson, was appointed president at Rensselaer Polytech in late 90s. Ruth Simmons, early 2000s at Brown. She was the first and now again the only Black woman at an Ivy League school, as we saw what happened to Dr. Gay.
Yeah.
Beverly Tatum at Spelman, Julianne Malveaux at Bennett, Gwendolyn Boyd at Alabama State, HBCU, and Brenda Allen at Lincoln, also an HBCU, and Carmen Amber up at Oberlin. So what I did was basically look at everything that was written in the press about these women. And based on that, came up with basically three findings that if they were not a historic first, so for example, Janetta Cole, or there was some controversy around their presidency, which I can say more about, they were basically invisible in the press. There was next to nothing written about them. The second interesting thing, particularly for the earlier presidents, and I'm saying when I say earlier, we're still talking 80s to early 2000s.
Right.
They were very much written about in a physical way. So
Mhm.
their appearance was described in a lot of these articles. Um, and then the last thing I would say, the third finding was this notion of a strong Black woman, a superwoman. They were often had their backgrounds discussed, their upbringings, and very much all that they had to sacrifice in order to get to that point. And it was told repeatedly, right? Just emphasizing um, how strong these women had to be.
Yeah, we've heard that narrative way too much for
Yeah.
sure.
As it came to the controversy piece, I also find it fascinating. Dr. Gwendolyn Boyd, scientist, doctor, she had a PhD. She was a graduate of Alabama State. And in her contract, because she was unmarried, there was a clause that she could not have overnight guests of a romantic interest in the president's house. And I love to say to people, what year do you think that was? And it was 2014.
Wow.
Yeah. So, she is quoted as saying she knew it was in her contract. She understood. She was fine with it. Um, but the press took that and ran with it. And rightfully so, because when have you ever seen, that type of stipulation included in a contract? And Alabama State is actually a public institution, so you can see all of their presidential contracts, and it was never there before. So just the notion of her personal, the utmost personal part of her life being a part of her contract to take this job, completely unrelated to her work and her expertise as a leader, became the dominant narrative. Once the discussion of her contract quieted down, didn't hear a thing about her. Just, kind of emphasizing this notion that we are hyper, watched in a way, whereas if they weren't written about, it's like they were completely invisible, right? So it's like, pick your poison. And then constantly in this space, right? Constantly repeating how they were brought up, where they were brought up, typically not in a economically resourced area, right? Like just constantly repeating that. It reinforces certain stereotypes about Black people and Black women in particular.
Yeah, and I found that whenever adjectives are used in any context, that there's a comparison being made. So when it comes to the expectations of Black women presidents, who or what are they being compared to? And are those comparisons fair, realistic, and equitable?
Well, I think leadership on a whole is very gendered, right? And there's been countless studies that talk about masculinity signals things like strength and tough and in control and aggressive, right? And femininity is the opposite of these things. It's you know just the opposite. Yet when women perform in a masculine way, right? So if you have, and I saw this with Dr. Jackson, if you are straightforward, if you are, direct, that is not the way a woman is expected to lead. And they're received poorly, right? So you're being compared to this notion of what leadership is, but when you behave that way, it's not appropriate, right? So yeah, I think, they're being compared to leadership, which is constructed around white heterosexual men, right? When you look at universities around the country, there are about 4,000 four-year institutions, and there are 82 of them that have Black women presidents. The vast majority are men, white men, over 60 years old. Yet that doesn't reflect what, the student population looks like. So, is it a fair comparison? Absolutely not, right? Their leadership styles are not viewed in the way that leadership is viewed, if that makes sense. And I think it also relates back to that third finding in that, these women have to be perfect. There is no room for error. And they will say that themselves, that they knew what they were doing. It's a trope that we hear all the time about, you've got to be 10 times as good to get equally as far. But they were aware of that, and they knew how they were being compared. Yeah.
Wow. And perfect as defined by people who are not them. So
Right.
subjective, it changes, that we know as well.
Absolutely. And it's subjective in a way where who gets to define, completely unrelated but related. We talk a lot about hair, right? And what is professional and what is acceptable. Well, who has defined, what is acceptable and professional for them? And I've noticed, not any of the women in my study particularly, but I've seen other Black women presidents and other Black women in the spotlight with very conformative styles, particularly around hair. And then when they resign or out of office, the braids come out, the twists come out, the natural hair comes out, right? And they're cognizant of that expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the truth. Yeah. So what responsibility does the press have in presenting accurate and unbiased information?
So there is a responsibility, but I think before getting to that responsibility, thinking about the history of media, right? If research has proven that media shapes the public agenda, it shapes national conversations, and it has the power to set these things. If you think, and you don't have to go too far back, but even if you go back to the beginning of what we consider media, television, things like that, think about the representations of African Americans and people from the diaspora, right? And what stereotypes those conform to. News media historically has reinforced gender and racial stereotypes. That has been throughout history. And today, I would argue, right? You see a bit more diversity and representation now, but it's not great.
Right.
So I think one part of it is understanding the genesis of media and how they've always performed in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue they absolutely have a responsibility to present in an accurate way. The way people are portrayed is very important. And if you think about leadership and getting into leadership positions, think about who is consuming this media and who are the decision makers. Right? So if you don't see Black women represented positively, or if you don't, outside of a scandal, do you think of them as a leader? Do they meet that profile that you expect a leader to be? Or is it someone else? Definitely think there's a responsibility. Am I confident that it's seen that way? No.
Yeah, I'm sure the media can't argue today that they don't know the impact that their narrative has on the perspective and perceptions that people have and how far that goes and the opportunities that are created and limited based on
Absolutely.
what they put out there. And of course, not all media is bad, but I think that
Sure.
too often they want to be the first to get a story out. So sometimes facts and certain data points aren't as relevant as being first, and there's a lot of I guess powers that be that want to make sure a certain narrative continues to be perpetuated. So there's
Mm-hmm.
that too, but I'm not supposed to be saying my opinion. I'm just asking
No,
questions.
please. I mean, you're absolutely right. And if you think about what gets covered, I mean, again, there has been research done that shows, the number of positive stories versus negative stories where African Americans are the protagonists, right? And you can just imagine which is shown more. Yeah, I mean, there's power in who is represented and how they're portrayed.
Yeah, there is. And we talked about this a little bit, but what impact does the narrative perpetuated by the press have on current and future Black women presidents?
Yeah, for the presidents themselves, I think it furthers that pressure, that expectation of being a superwoman, of being able to handle it all, of not needing help, of that strength, um, which some people perceive as a positive, right? But we're also seeing the impact of that on women's health, on their physical health, on their mental health.
Right.
Um, recently she wasn't a president, she was a vice president, and she committed suicide. She had been, raising concerns about how she was treated. She recognized that she needed some space, and it wasn't given. So there were real consequences to this. I think in terms of the impact, college presidents are chosen by their board of trustees, right? Every institution has a board of directors, board of trustees. And these are not necessarily folks in higher education. They're, business leaders in many different industries who consume media, right? They are consuming these images that are being portrayed, whether it's through print or television, et cetera. And even though we know diversity in leadership results in better outcomes, better revenues, that, if you put the two next to each other, it's not telling a consistent story. And why is that? I think Black women aren't seen as competent and not portrayed in these ways that we see. Who's gonna take a chance on that? Go to your tried and true. And as the number of the amount of turnover in the presidency is increasing, okay, so who are we going to be the next leaders of these institutions?
Mm-hmm.
So I think without proper representation, proper exposure to all of the positives that Black women bring, it's just one more way that we're hampered in advancing.
Very true. And you talk about going to tried and true when they don't have experience with Black women and people of color, when they don't live around them, have them in their circles. So all they have left is what they see and read in the media and other sources. So they go
Absolutely.
to what they know, and even still, who they know, they're given more chances. So if they hire someone tried and true and they make a mistake, they can understand why a mistake was made, and they're giving another
Absolutely.
chance. But for Black women, we find that we have to be their version of perfect, whatever that
Mm-hmm.
criteria is today, because it's a moving
Mm-hmm.
target. And
Right.
then, should we make a mistake, it's escalated, elevated, and the chances of us getting another chance are a bit slimmer.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're seeing that play out. I mean, we watched that play out, since the end of last year, beginning of this year, when three women college presidents appeared in front of Congress, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, going back to representation, only about 25% of college presidents are women. But the three that they had there were all women. I find that interesting. Um,
It's so true. Hazel Jack, thank you so much for this conversation. It's very timely, and I appreciate your perspectives. I'm sharing them today with us.
Thank you for inviting me.